The sun rose over Enugu, casting a golden hue over the city's bustling streets. But for Obinna and Chimamanda, the warmth of the morning light did little to thaw the lingering chill that clung to their hearts. It had been 3 years since they fled Nsukka, 3 years since they left behind the home that had become a prison of memories, and yet the shadows of their past followed them like a persistent echo. Their new life was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to rebuild from the ashes of their trauma. But the past, it seemed, had a way of clinging to you, no matter how far you ran. Obinna had opened a small construction supply shop in one of the quieter neighborhoods of Enugu, pouring his energy into the business in an attempt to drown out the ghosts of his memories. He spent his days hauling materials, negotiating with suppliers, and plastering a friendly smile across his face for customers. But when the day's work was done, and he returned home to the small apartment they now called home, to the small apartment they now called home, the weight of the silence pressed down on him like a stone. Chimamanda, meanwhile, had taken a job at a local health clinic, immersing herself in the care of others to avoid confronting the gaping wound in her own heart. She was known for her gentle touch and compassionate demeanor, and patients often remarked on how her presence seemed to bring a sense of calm. But behind her warm smile and soft words was a woman haunted by memories she couldn't escape. Nights were the hardest. When the city's noise faded into the distance and the walls of their apartment grew too quiet, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the nightmares to come. And they always did. In the darkness of their bedroom, Chimamanda would hear the soft whisper of her name, a voice too familiar to be mistaken. Mama, it was Ikena's voice, innocent and sweet, the voice of the boy she had once cradled in her arms. But when she turned to find the source, all she would see was the emptiness, the shadows that danced in the corners of the room. She would wake with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding like a drum against her rib cage. Obinna, sleeping beside her, would stir at her gasps, pulling her close, whispering reassurances into her ear, but his words, though tender, felt hollow. They both knew the truth. Some wounds couldn't be soothed with whispered comforts. One morning, as Chimamanda prepared for her shift at the clinic, she found an envelope slipped beneath their front door. There was no stamp, no address, just one word written on the front in a handwriting that sent a shiver down her spine. Mama. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her breath hitching in her throat. For a moment she considered throwing it away, pretending she hadn't seen it, but something deeper, an instinct she couldn't ignore, urged her to open it. Inside, the message was short, written in red ink that bled into the paper like fresh wounds. Did you miss me, Mama? I'll see you soon. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be. Chimamanda felt her knees buckle as the letter slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. The room seemed to spin around her, the walls closing in as the air grew thick and suffocating. Obinna found her moments later, sitting on the kitchen floor, the letter clutched in her hands, her face pale and drawn. He took the paper from her trembling fingers, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing, the weight of the message sinking in. Then, with a quiet resolve, he crumpled the letter and tossed it into the trash. It's just a prank, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Someone must have found out about Nsuka. It doesn't mean anything. But Chimamanda could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She knew better. This wasn't a prank. It was a promise. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in their home grew heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating them under the weight of their unspoken fears. Chimamanda started noticing small things. Doors left ajar that she was sure she'd closed, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, and the feeling of being watched, even when she was alone. At night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she found herself waking with the same phrase echoing in her ears. "I'm coming home." Obinna tried to dismiss it all as coincidence, insisting they were just stressed, that they were letting their past haunt them more than it should. But even he couldn't ignore the growing unease. One evening, as he was closing up his shop, he noticed something carved into the wooden door. It was a symbol, crude and jagged, but unmistakable. It was the same symbol from Adaise's journal, the same one tied to the ritual that had brought Ikenna into their lives. That night, Obinna finally admitted what they both knew, but had been too afraid to say aloud. "He's found us," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "I don't know how, but he's here." Chimamanda nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice breaking under the weight of her fear. Obinna didn't have an answer. The next day, they sought out the local priest at the nearby church, hoping for guidance, for some kind of protection. But after listening to their story, the priest shook his head, his face pale. "This is beyond my understanding," he admitted. "I can pray for you, but you need someone who understands these kinds of things. Someone older." It was a neighbor, an old woman who had overheard their conversation, who pointed them toward Mama Neka, a spiritualist known for dealing with dark forces. She lived on the outskirts of the city, in a small, weathered house surrounded by thick woods and an air of mystery. When they arrived, Mama Neka greeted them with a knowing look, as if she had been expecting them. "You carry a darkness with you," she said, her voice low and raspy. "Tell me everything." As Obinna and Chimamanda recounted their story, the rituals, the possession, the escape, Mama Neka listened intently, her eyes narrowing with each detail. When they finished, she sat in silence for a long moment before finally speaking. "This spirit is old, older than you can imagine. Your wife, Adais, she didn't just pray for a child. She made a pact, and when she died, that pact didn't die with her. It passed on to the boy." Obinna felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. "Can we stop it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Mama Neka's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Maybe," she said, "but it will come at a price." Chimamanda felt her heart sink. She had already lost so much. What more would they have to give? As they left Mama Neka's home, the weight of her words hung over them like a dark cloud. They had fled Nsukka, hoping to leave the past behind. But the past had followed them, and now there was no running from it. There was only one path left. They had to confront it head on. The days after their visit to Mama Neka felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing against their chests with every breath. Obinna tried to maintain the rhythm of normal life, opening his shop each morning, nodding politely to customers, and pretending that their world wasn't unraveling one thread at a time, but beneath his calm exterior, a storm brewed. Every creak of the floorboards at night, every flicker of the lights felt like a prelude to something darker, something inevitable. For Chimamanda, the thin veil of control she'd clung to was beginning to tear. At the clinic, she would find herself staring blankly at patients, their voices fading into the background as her mind replayed the whispers that haunted her nights. The letter had been the first sign, but now the signs were everywhere. The subtle disturbances in their home had grown bolder. Windows they were sure had been latched were found wide open in the morning, their curtains fluttering like skeletal fingers in the wind. The mirror in their bedroom fogged over with strange symbols, even when the air was dry and still. The scent of earth, damp, rich, and unsettling, lingered in the corners of their apartment, as if the walls themselves were breathing in the decay of something ancient. Obinna found himself waking at odd hours, convinced he'd heard footsteps in the hall. At first, he dismissed it as the sounds of the apartment building settling, the echoes of their neighbors' late-night movements. But when he began to find faint, muddy footprints on the living room floor, small, like those of a child, his denial crumbled. He tried scrubbing them away, but the stains always returned, darker, more pronounced, as if mocking his efforts. One night, as Chimamanda lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she felt it, the undeniable presence of someone or something in the room with her. The air grew cold, prickling against her skin, and a soft, almost tender whisper brushed against her ear. Mama. The voice was unmistakable, filled with a longing that twisted her heart and chilled her to the bone. She shot up, gasping, her eyes darting around the darkened room. But Obinna was still asleep beside her, his breathing deep and steady, unaware of the terror unfolding inches from his side. The next morning, Chimamanda found a second letter slipped under their door. This time there was no greeting, no pretense of warmth, just a simple, chilling message written in the same red ink. You can't hide from me. Obinna's hands trembled as he read the letter. He tried to be strong, to shield Manda from the worst of his fears, but now any illusion of safety had been stripped away. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. We're not going to let him win, he whispered, more to himself than to her. But the conviction in his voice felt thin, stretched to its breaking point. That evening, Obinna went to lock the front door before bed, only to find it slightly ajar. He was sure he had locked it when he returned from the shop. His heart pounded as he pushed it open, scanning the dimly lit hallway beyond. Nothing. But as he stepped back inside, he noticed something carved into the wood just above the handle. A symbol, crude and jagged, identical to the ones Adaze had drawn in her journal. His stomach turned. He didn't tell Chimamanda. Not yet. He needed to protect her, even if it was just from the knowledge of how close their past had come. But Chimamanda didn't need to see the symbol to know the truth. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer in their apartment, in the oppressive silence that settled over them each night. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave for work, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and froze. Standing just behind her, barely visible, was a figure, a boy with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. She spun around, heart racing, but the hallway was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone, leaving only her pale, terrified reflection staring back. Unable to bear the growing dread alone, Chimamanda finally confided in a colleague at the clinic, an older nurse named Ngozi. Ngozi listened intently, her face growing more serious with each detail Manda shared. When she finished, Ngozi placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "This is not something you can fight alone," she said softly. "There's a priest at my church, Father Amadi. He's dealt with things like this before. You should speak with him." Desperate for any kind of solution, Obinna and Chimamanda visited Father Amadi that evening. The church was small but comforting, its walls lined with candles that flickered gently, casting long shadows across the wooden pews. Father Amadi listened without interruption as they recounted their story, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he sat in silence for a long moment before finally speaking. "This is not just a restless spirit," he said quietly. "It's something older, something tied to the very soul of your family, the bond between you and the boy. It feeds whatever this is. It grows stronger the more you fear it." He sighed, folding his hands in front of him. "I can offer prayers, blessings, but this is beyond the church's reach. You need someone who understands the old ways." Obinna felt a sinking sensation in his chest. They had hoped for a clear solution, a quick fix to banish the darkness that haunted them. But now they were back to square one with nothing but the growing certainty that time was running out. It was Ngozi who once again provided a glimmer of hope. She mentioned a woman, Mama Neka, a traditional spiritualist known for her knowledge of ancient rituals and her ability to confront dark forces. "She lives on the edge of town," Ngozi said. "People don't talk about her much, but those who've needed her help, they say she's the real deal." With no other options, Obinna and Chimamanda sought out Mama Neneka. Her home was a small, weathered hut nestled among towering trees, the air thick with the scent of herbs and something more metallic, something like blood. When they arrived, Mama Neka was already waiting, seated on a wooden stool by the fire, her eyes sharp and knowing. "You've brought a shadow with you," she said before they could even speak. "Sit. Tell me everything." As they spoke, Mama Neka listened with a quiet intensity, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. When they finished, she nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "This spirit," she said, her voice low and gravelly, "it's tied to a covenant made long before you understood its consequences. Your wife Adaziz made a deal, not just for a child, but for something more. And when she died, the spirit didn't leave. It attached itself to the boy, and through him to you." Obinna swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Can we break it?" Mama Neka's eyes met his, unwavering. "Perhaps, but it won't be easy, and it won't be without sacrifice." As they left her home, the weight of her words settled over them like a heavy shroud. They had escaped Ansuka, fled the physical manifestation of their past. But the spirit had followed, and now it was clear that running would no longer save them. The only way forward was to confront the darkness head on, no matter the cost. The apartment felt colder now, as if the walls themselves were leaching warmth from the air, draining the light from their lives. Obinna sat at the edge of their small kitchen table, staring at the crumpled letter Chimamanda had left on the counter before heading to work. The ink, though dry, seemed to bleed into the paper like a fresh wound refusing to heal. "You can't hide from me." The words repeated in his mind over and over, a haunting mantra that refused to fade. But it wasn't just the letter, it was everything. The shadows that lingered too long in the corners of rooms, the quiet footsteps echoing through the hallways at night, and the suffocating presence that seemed to hover over them no matter where they went. They couldn't escape it, and after their visit to Mama Neka, Obinna knew they couldn't run from it anymore. There was only one path left: understanding what Ades had done and facing whatever consequences remained. That evening, Chimamanda returned from the clinic looking pale and exhausted. The fear that had become a constant shadow in her eyes seemed to deepen, darkening the soft warmth that once defined her. She placed her bag down with trembling hands and walked straight to Obinna without a word. He could see it. She was unraveling, each day pulling at the frayed edges of her strength. "We need to go back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Obinna didn't need to ask where. Ansuka, the town they had fled, the place where it all began. It was the last thing either of them wanted, but it was the only place that held the answers they needed. But before they could leave, Obinna knew they had to understand the full extent of Adaeze's actions. If they were to confront this spirit, they needed to know what deal had been made and at what cost. Digging through the few belongings they had kept from Ansuka, Chimamanda found an old, dusty box Obinna had nearly forgotten. It was tucked in the back of their closet, buried beneath layers of clothes and other items they had packed in haste during their escape. Inside was Adaeze's journal, bound in worn leather, its edges frayed and pages yellowed with age. Obinna had never dared to read it before, believing some things were better left untouched. But now, as Chimamanda opened the book and the first page crackled under her fingers, he realized the truth couldn't be ignored any longer. The early entries were filled with hope and longing. Adaeze had written about her dreams of becoming a mother, about the prayers whispered into the night as she knelt beside their bed, asking God for the blessing of a child. Her words were tender, full of love and unwavering faith, painting the picture of a woman desperate to fill the void in her heart. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The neat, careful handwriting became more erratic, the lines darker, as if pressed into the paper with a trembling hand. Adaeze wrote about the whispers she began to hear in her dreams, the shadowy figure that appeared at the edge of her vision during the day. She spoke of a woman in a nearby village, one rumored to have the power to grant wishes when all else failed. "I couldn't wait any longer," Adaeze had written. "The woman promised me a child, but she warned me there would be a price. I didn't care. I just wanted to hold my baby in my arms." Obinna's heart pounded as he read those words, his mind racing with the implications. He turned the page, his eyes scanning the frantic scribbles that followed. Adaeze described the ritual in chilling detail, the offerings she made, the incantations whispered into the dark, and the overwhelming sense of dread that followed. She wrote about the day she discovered she was pregnant, a joy so immense it drowned out the growing fear inside her. But the fear never left. "I feel him growing," she wrote. "But something else is growing too. I see it in his eyes when I dream. He's not just my son. There's something dark inside him, something that doesn't belong. Obinna closed the journal, his hands trembling. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, suffocating him with the weight of Adaise's words. Chimamanda sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the closed book, as if she could still hear the echoes of Adaise's desperation. Mama Neka was right, Chimamanda whispered. Ikena wasn't just a child. He was part of that deal. Obinna nodded, his throat tight. And now he's come to collect. The next morning, they packed their bags and left for Nusuka. The journey was quiet, the hum of the car engine the only sound between them. The familiar red earth road stretched ahead, winding through the landscape like veins pulsing with memories they couldn't escape. As they approached the town, Obinna felt a knot tighten in his chest. The place that once held their hopes and dreams now loomed before them like a specter, its streets haunted by the past they tried to leave behind. Their old home stood at the edge of town, its once vibrant clay walls now faded and cracked. The windows were covered in a thin layer of dust, but Obinna could feel the house watching them, waiting for their return. As they stepped inside, the air grew thick, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The house hadn't been touched since they left, but it felt alive, as if it had been waiting, biding its time. Mama Neka arrived shortly after, her presence filling the space with a strange mix of comfort and dread. She moved through the house with purpose, her eyes scanning the walls, the floors, the ceiling, as if she could see the invisible threads that connected their lives to the darkness that lingered. "This is where it began," she said quietly, "and this is where it must end." She instructed them to gather the items needed for the ritual: Adaise's journal, the necklace she had worn during the ritual, and something that belonged to Ikena, a small wooden toy Obinna, found in the corner of his old bedroom, covered in dust, but still intact. As they prepared for the ritual, Mama Neka warned them of what was to come. "The spirit will fight," she said. "It will use your love, your memories, your guilt. It will try to convince you to stop, but you must not waver. The bond between you and the boy is its strength. To break it, you must let him go completely." Chimamanda's heart ached at those words. She had loved Ikena as her own, cradled him in her arms, whispered lullabies into his ear. Even after everything, a part of her still clung to the memory of the boy he once was, the boy she had tried so hard to save. But now she realized that love was the very thing keeping the darkness alive. As night fell, they gathered in the center of the house, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. Mama Neka began the incantations, her voice low and steady, weaving through the air like a thread pulling at the edges of reality. The temperature dropped, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of the ritual. Then they heard it, the soft, familiar voice that had haunted Chimamanda's dreams. "Mama." The sound came from the darkness beyond the flickering light, a voice filled with longing and pain. But it wasn't Ikena. Not really. It was the spirit, wearing his voice like a mask. Chimamanda felt her resolve waver, tears filling her eyes as the voice grew louder, more desperate. But Obinna took her hand, his grip grounding her in the reality of the moment. "This isn't him," he whispered. "Let him go." With a trembling breath, Chimamanda faced the darkness, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. "I love you, Ikena, but you're not my son anymore. The spirit screamed, a sound that rattled the very walls of the house. But Chimamanda didn't flinch. The bond was breaking. The bond was breaking. The darkness was losing its grip. And for the first time in years, they could see a glimmer of light on the horizon. But the fight was far from over. The days that followed their return to Nsuka felt like walking through a waking nightmare. The house, once their sanctuary, had become a twisted reflection of the life they'd built and lost. The walls seemed to pulse with a quiet malevolence, and the air felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale its darkness. Chimamanda tried to keep busy, scrubbing the floors, wiping down the windows, and unpacking the few belongings they had brought with them. But no matter how hard she worked, the house never felt clean. The dust settled back in minutes, the windows fogged up with strange, indecipherable symbols, and the air grew thick with an unshakable sense of dread. It was as if the house was alive, feeding off their fear, growing stronger with every passing moment. At night, the disturbances became unbearable. The first night, it was the whispers. They started as soft murmurs, like distant conversations just out of earshot, but soon they grew louder, more insistent, until Chimamanda could hear her name being called over and over and over again. Mama, Mama. The voice was unmistakable, filled with a sickly sweetness that twisted her heart with both longing and fear. She would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, only to find Obinna staring at the ceiling, his eyes wide open, his face pale. He heard it too. The second night, it was the footsteps. They echoed through the hallways, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing the length of the house, waiting for them to make a move. Obinna would get up, flashlight in hand, and search the entire house, but he never found anything. Yet, when he returned to bed, the footsteps would start again, closer this time, right outside their door. But it was the third night that broke them. Chimamanda had just drifted off to sleep when she felt it, a cold, clammy hand brushing against her cheek. She snapped awake, her heart pounding in her chest, and there he was, Ikenna, standing at the foot of their bed, his face pale and twisted, his eyes hollow and unblinking. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, only the silent scream of a boy lost to something far darker than death. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Obinna jolted awake beside her, and when he saw Ikenna, his face went as white as the sheets. But in the blink of an eye, he was gone, just like that, as if he'd never been there at all. They couldn't deny it any longer. The house wasn't just haunted by memories. It was haunted by Ikenna, or at least the twisted, malevolent spirit that had consumed him. They needed help, and they needed it fast. The next morning, they returned to Mama Nika, their faces pale and drawn, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. Mama Nika greeted them at the door, her expression grave but unsurprised. She led them inside, where the scent of burning herbs filled the air, mingling with the faint, metallic tang of something older and more sinister. "You've angered it," she said, her voice low and steady. "It knows you're trying to break the bond, and it won't let go without a fight." Chimamanda's voice trembled as she spoke. "What do we do?" "It's getting stronger. Every night, it's..." Her voice caught in her throat, the memory of Ikenna's hollow eyes searing into her mind. Mama Neka nodded, her eyes narrowing. "You must confront it directly, but first you need to weaken it. She explained that the spirit fed on their fear, their guilt, and most of all, Chimamanda's unresolved love for Ikena. To break the spirit's hold, Chimamanda would have to sever that emotional connection completely. But that was easier said than done. As they returned home that evening, Chimamanda felt the weight of Mama Neka's words pressing down on her. How could she let go of the boy she had loved, the boy she had raised as her own? Even after everything, a part of her still believed Ikena could be saved, that somewhere deep inside the darkness, her son was still there, waiting for her to bring him back. But Obinna saw it differently. He had always been the practical one, the realist. To him, Ikena was gone, and what remained was nothing more than a vessel for something evil. "You have to let him go, Manda," he said quietly as they sat in the living room, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. "If you don't, we'll never be free." Chimamanda nodded, but her heart ached with the weight of his words. That night, the spirit grew bolder. The whispers were louder, the footsteps heavier, and the cold presence in the house more suffocating than ever before. But it wasn't until Chimamanda woke to find herself standing in the middle of the backyard, barefoot and shivering, that she realized how deep the spirit's hold had become. She had no memory of leaving the bed, no recollection of walking through the house. Yet there she was, standing under the pale moonlight, staring at the shadowy figure that lingered at the edge of the woods. It was Ikena. But this time, there was no mistaking the darkness in his eyes, the twisted grin on his face. He wasn't calling for her, wasn't begging for her love. He was waiting, waiting for her to fall completely into his grasp. Obinna found her moments later, his heart pounding in his chest as he pulled her back into the house. She was cold to the touch, her skin clammy, her eyes vacant. It took hours for her to snap out of the trance, and when she did, she collapsed into Obinna's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "I can't do this," she whispered through her tears. "I can't let him go." But Obinna held her tightly, his own tears mingling with hers. "You have to, Manda. It's the only way." The next day, they returned to Mama Neka one last time. She prepared them for what was to come, instructing them on the final steps of the ritual. Chimamanda would have to confront the spirit face, to look into the eyes of the boy she once loved and sever the bond that tied them together. But Mama Neka warned them, if Chimamanda hesitated, even for a moment, the spirit would take her. It would consume her completely, and there would be no bringing her back. As they left, the gravity of what lay ahead settled over them like a suffocating shroud. They had faced many horrors, but none as terrifying as the thought of losing each other. Yet, deep down, they both knew there was no other choice. The house waited for them, its walls pulsing with anticipation, its shadows growing darker with each passing moment. But this time, they weren't running. This time, they were ready to face the darkness head on, no matter the cost. As the sun set and the house was swallowed by night, Chimamanda took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. She could feel the spirit's presence closing in, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. This was the final stand. And no matter what happened, she wouldn't let the darkness win. The night had fallen like a thick, suffocating blanket over Nsuka, and the house sat in eerie silence, as if it were holding its breath. Chimamanda and Obinna stood in the center of the living room, the flickering candlelight casting long, wavering shadows on the cracked walls. The air was dense, heavy with the scent of burning herbs and the metallic tang of fear. The symbols Mama Neka had drawn in chalk encircled them, forming a fragile barrier between them and the darkness that lurked just beyond. Chimamanda's heart pounded in her chest like a frantic drumbeat, each pulse echoing in her ears. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the finality of what was to come. This was the night they would confront the spirit, the night they would face Ikena, or what was left of him, and try to break the bond that had haunted them for so long. Obina's hand was warm in hers, grounding her in the reality of the moment. His grip was firm, steady, but she could feel the tension in his muscles, the unspoken fear that mirrored her own. They were in this together, but Chimamanda knew that the true battle was hers to fight. It was her love, her unresolved grief, that the spirit clung to, and it was only by letting go that she could hope to set them free. Mama Neka stood at the edge of the circle, her eyes sharp and unwavering. She began to chant in a low rhythmic voice, the ancient words weaving through the air like a spell. The flames of the candles flickered in response, casting strange shifting patterns on the walls. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Chimamanda felt a cold breeze brush against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. Then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but they grew louder, more distinct, until Chimamanda could hear Ikena's voice, soft and pleading. Mama, Mama, don't leave me. The sound of his voice pierced her heart, stirring memories of the boy she had cradled in her arms, the boy whose laughter once filled their home with light. Chimamanda squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. Mama, I'm scared. Don't you love me anymore? The words wrapped around her like chains, pulling at her heart, threatening to break her resolve. Obina's voice cut through the din, low and firm. Manda, it's not him. Don't listen. Chimamanda opened her eyes, her gaze locking onto the shadows that writhed just beyond the circle, and then she saw him. Ikena stood at the edge of the room, his small frame illuminated by the flickering candlelight. His eyes were wide and hollow, his face pale and twisted with sorrow. But there was something else in his gaze, something dark and unnatural, that sent a chill down Chimamanda's spine. This wasn't the boy she had loved. This was something else entirely. The spirit took a step forward, and the candles flickered violently, casting the room into brief, suffocating darkness. When the light returned, Ikena was closer. His eyes locked onto Chimamanda's with an intensity that made her stomach twist. Mama, he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. Chimamanda felt tears welling in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay strong. She knew what the spirit was doing, using her love, her guilt, to keep its hold on them. She took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. Ikena, she said softly, her eyes never leaving his. I loved you. I still do. But you're not my son. Not anymore. The spirit's face twisted in rage, and a guttural scream filled the room, shaking the walls and extinguishing the candles. The room was plunged into darkness, and Chimamanda felt a cold, suffocating presence surround her, pressing in from all sides. Obina's hand tightened around hers, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. Don't let go, Manda. Stay with me. Chimamanda focused on his voice, drawing strength from his presence. She could feel the spirit's anger, its desperation, but she refused to give in. She thought of the real Ikena, the boy who had once been innocent before the darkness had taken hold. And she knew deep down that he wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want her to be trapped in this nightmare. With a surge of determination, Chimamanda stepped forward, her voice rising above the spirit's screams. "You are not my son," she shouted, her words cutting through the darkness like a blade. "You will not control me. You will not control us." The spirit let out a final, ear-splitting scream, and the room seemed to shudder, the very air vibrating with its fury. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise ceased, the oppressive weight lifted, and the cold presence receded, leaving behind a still, eerie silence. The candles flickered back to life, casting a warm golden glow over the room. Ikena was gone. The shadows had retreated, and the house felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. Chimamanda collapsed into Obinna's arms, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. They had done it. They had done it. They had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side. Mama Neka stepped into the circle, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "It is done," she said softly. "The bond has been broken." But as Chimamanda and Obinna looked around the room, they knew that, while spirit had been banished, the scars it left behind would take much longer to heal. The house, their lives, would never be the same. But they were free, and that was enough. For now, as they left the house the next morning, the sun rising over Nsukka, Chimamanda felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with memories they could never fully escape, but they had faced the darkness together, and that was a victory in itself. And though the shadows would always linger at the edges of their minds, they knew one thing for certain: they would never let fear define them again. The morning after the ritual was eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, unsure of what had just occurred. Chimamanda and Obinna awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside their window, the first natural sound they'd heard in what felt like forever. For a moment, it almost felt normal, as if they had stepped out of a nightmare and into the soft light of a new day. But the silence inside the house wasn't comforting. It was hollow, like the aftermath of a storm that had torn through their lives and left everything in disarray. Chimamanda sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the faint outline of the symbols Mama Neka had drawn on the walls. Though the spirit had been banished, the house still felt tainted, like it was holding on to the last remnants of the darkness that had consumed their lives. She ran her fingers over the grooves in the wood, her heart heavy with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The ritual had freed them from Ikena's grip, but it hadn't erased the years of fear, guilt, and heartbreak that clung to them like a second skin. Obinna entered the room, his face drawn with exhaustion, but softened by a tentative smile. He placed a gentle hand on Chimamanda's shoulder, grounding her in the present. "We should leave," he said quietly. "This house, it's not ours anymore." Chimamanda nodded, her throat tight. Leaving Nansukka again felt different this time. The first time, they had fled in fear, desperate to escape the shadows of their past. But now, they were leaving with a sense of closure, even if it was incomplete. The house had been a symbol of their hopes, their dreams of building a family. But it had also been the epicenter of their greatest tragedy. It was time to let go. They packed their belongings in silence, each item a reminder of the life they had tried to build. As Chimamanda folded the last of their clothes, her eyes fell on Adaze's journal. She picked it up, feeling the weight of its pages, the secrets it held. For a moment, she considered leaving it behind, burying it with the past. But something stopped her. The journal was a part of their story, a painful but necessary chapter. She slipped it into her bag, knowing that the past couldn't be forgotten, only understood. Before they left, they walked through the house one last time. The walls, once vibrant with the warmth of their love, now stood as silent witnesses to their pain. Chimamanda paused in what had once been Ikena's room, the faint scent of his childhood lingering in the air. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of grief for the boy she had loved and lost. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and walked away. They returned to Enugu, hoping to rebuild their lives in the small apartment they had left behind. But the weight of what they had experienced followed them like a shadow, seeping into every corner of their existence. Chimamanda found herself waking in the middle of the night, her heart racing, convinced she could still hear Ikena's voice whispering her name. Obinna threw himself into his work, trying to drown out the memories with the routine of daily life. But no matter how hard they tried, the past was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Weeks turned into months, and the distance between them grew. They spoke less, their conversations limited to the mundane details of daily life. The bond that had once been their strength felt fragile, stretched thin by the weight of unspoken fears and unresolved grief. Chimamanda knew they needed to confront their pain, to talk about what had happened, but the words felt too heavy, too dangerous. It was easier to pretend, to move through life as if the past hadn't left an indelible mark on their hearts. One evening, as they sat in silence at the dinner table, Obinna finally broke the quiet. "We can't keep living like this, Manda," he said, his voice low but steady. "We survived, but we're not living. We need to find a way to heal." Chimamanda looked up, her eyes filled with tears. She knew he was right. They had faced the darkness together, but they hadn't allowed themselves to heal from it. The wounds were still fresh, still bleeding beneath the surface. She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I don't know how," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but I want to try." Obinna squeezed her hand, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "We'll figure it out, together." They began attending counseling sessions, seeking help from professionals who could guide them through the process of healing. It wasn't easy. The sessions forced them to confront the pain they had buried, to relive the memories they had tried to forget. But it also gave them a space to share their grief, to support each other in ways they hadn't been able to before. Chimamanda started journaling, pouring her thoughts and emotions onto paper. She wrote about Ikena, about the love she had for him and the pain of losing him. She wrote about the guilt that clung to her, the questions that haunted her, the questions that haunted her. But she also wrote about the strength she found in Obinna, the hope that they could build a future together despite the scars of their past. Obinna found solace in his work, but he also made time for moments of connection with Chimamanda. They began to rediscover the small joys in life, the warmth of a shared meal, the comfort of a shared meal, the comfort of a quiet evening together, the laughter that slowly returned to their lives. It wasn't a perfect process, and there were days when the weight of their past felt overwhelming. But they faced it together, step by step, finding strength in each other. As the months passed, Chimamanda began to feel a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The nightmares grew less frequent, and the whispers faded into the background. The apartment, once filled with the echoes of their fear, became a home again, a place where they could rebuild their lives, free from the shadows of the past. One day, as Chimamanda was organizing their bookshelf, she came across Adese's journal. She sat down, running her fingers over the worn leather cover, and opened it to the last entry. Adeyes had written about her hope for the future, her belief that love could conquer any darkness. Chimamanda felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from gratitude, for the lessons learned, for the love that had endured, and for the love that had endured, and for the future that still lay ahead. She closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf, a symbol of their journey and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path to the light. And as she turned to Obinna, who was watching her with a soft smile, she knew that they had found their way back to each other. The scars of their past would always be a part of them, but they no longer defined them. They had faced the darkness and survived. And now they were ready to embrace the future together. Months passed, and life in Enugu slowly settled into a rhythm that Chimamanda and Obinna had long forgotten was possible. The city, with its bustling markets and warm evening breezes, began to feel like home again. The weight of their past, though still present, had loosened its grip, allowing them to breathe more freely, to smile without the constant shadow of fear lurking just behind their lips. But as anyone who's faced the kind of darkness they had would know, healing isn't a straight path. It winds and twists, and sometimes it circles back when you least expect it. One afternoon, Chimamanda was returning from the clinic where she had started volunteering again. The streets buzzed with life, children's laughter mingling with the cries of street vendors selling roasted corn and ripe plantains. It was almost enough to make her believe that their past had been left behind, that it was nothing more than a distant memory. But as she approached their apartment building, a familiar chill slid down her spine. It was subtle, like the faintest brush of cold fingers against her skin, but undeniable. At first, she tried to shake it off. Perhaps it was just the remnants of old fears creeping up when her guard was down. But when she reached their door, she stopped cold. There, tucked neatly under the welcome mat, was a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, deliberate, and chillingly familiar. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum signaling danger. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she stared at the envelope, willing it to be something, anything, other than what she feared. But deep down, she already knew. When Obinna arrived home later that evening, he found Chimamanda sitting at the kitchen table, the unopened letter in front of her like a ticking bomb. She looked up, her eyes wide and filled with the kind of fear he thought they'd left behind. "It's from him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Obinna's face darkened as he picked up the envelope. He turned it over in his hands, his jaw tightening. Without a word, he tore it open and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was short, but it sent a chill through both of them. "You think it's over? I'm always watching." The words felt like a slap, dragging them back into a nightmare. They thought they had escaped. Obinna crumpled the letter in his fist, his mind racing. They had done everything, faced the spirit, severed the bond, and moved on with their lives. But this wasn't just about the supernatural anymore. This was something deeper, something more sinister. They contacted the police, but without any concrete evidence or threats of immediate harm, there wasn't much the authorities could do. It's probably just someone playing a cruel joke, the officer suggested, though the look in his eyes said he wasn't entirely convinced. But Chimamanda and Obinna knew better. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a joke. This was a reminder, a message that no matter how far they ran, the past wasn't finished with them. Days turned into weeks, and while no more letters appeared, the sense of being watched never left. Chimamanda found herself glancing over her shoulder in the market, her eyes darting to every shadow, every unfamiliar face. Obinna became more protective, insisting on walking her to and from the clinic, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Then one evening, as they returned home from a late-night walk intended to clear their minds, they found the front door of their apartment slightly ajar. Obinna's heart dropped. He motioned for Chimamanda to stay back as he cautiously pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside the window. Everything seemed untouched, but there was a stillness in the air that made Obinna's skin crawl. He stepped inside, his every sense on high alert. And then he saw it. On the living room wall, scrawled in what looked like dark dried blood, was a single word, soon. Chimamanda gasped. When she saw it, her hand flying to her mouth, Obinna rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms as she trembled against him. The message was clear. Whoever or whatever was behind this wasn't done with them. They packed their bags that night, leaving the apartment behind without looking back. They moved to a small town on the outskirts of Enugu, hoping that distance and anonymity would finally grant them the peace they so desperately craved. But the fear followed them, lingering like a shadow at the edges of their lives. Chimamanda began having nightmares again. She would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that Ikenna, or whatever was left of him, was standing at the foot of their bed. Obinna tried to stay strong, but he too felt the weight of their past creeping back into their lives. They were trapped in a cycle of fear and uncertainty, unable to escape the ghost that haunted them. Then, one day, a letter arrived at their new address. There was no return address, but Chimamanda didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Her hands shook as she held the envelope, tears welling in her eyes. Obinna took the letter from her, his face hardening with determination. "This ends now," he said, his voice steady but filled with anger. They returned to Mama Neka, desperate for answers. She listened quietly as they recounted everything that had happened since the ritual. When they finished, she sat in silence for a long moment before finally speaking. "The spirit may have been banished," she said slowly, "but the bond wasn't just spiritual. It was emotional. As long as you hold on to the fear, the guilt and the pain, it will find a way back to you." Chimamanda's heart sank. She had tried to let go, tried to move on, but deep down, a part of her still clung to the memory of Ikenna, the boy she had loved, the son she had lost. "You need to confront it one last time," Mama Neka said. "Not just the spirit, but just the spirit, but yourselves. Only then will you be free." With Mama Neka's guidance, they prepared for one final confrontation. This time, it wasn't about rituals or chants. It was about facing their deepest fears and letting go of the pain that had bound them to the pain that had bound them to the past. They returned to the house in Ensuka, the place where it had all begun. The house was abandoned now, the walls crumbling, the windows shattered. But the moment they stepped inside, they felt it. The moment they stepped inside, they felt it, the presence that had haunted them for years. Chimamanda stood in the center of the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and spoke. Ikenna, she whispered, her voice steady. I loved you. I always will. But I can't carry this pain anymore. I let you go. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as her words echoed through the empty house. For the first time in years, Chimamanda felt a sense of peace wash over her, a lightness she hadn't known was possible. Obinna took her hand, and together they walked out of the house, leaving the past behind once and for all. As they drove away, Chimamanda looked out the window, watching as the house disappeared from view. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't from fear or sorrow. It was from the realization that they were finally free. The past would always be a part of them, but it no longer had the power to control their lives. They had faced the darkness, confronted their fears, and emerged stronger on the other side. And for the first time in a long time, they were ready to embrace the future together. Lesson learned: confronting the past to embrace the future. At its core, this story is about the power of confronting one's past and the weight of unresolved grief. Chimamanda and Obinna spent years trying to run from their pain, believing that distance could erase their trauma. But true healing doesn't come from avoidance. It comes from facing the darkness head on. The more they feared the past, the stronger its hold became. It was only by acknowledging their pain, it was only by acknowledging their guilt and choosing to let go that they were able to break free. Fear, grief, and guilt are chains that keep us trapped in cycles of suffering. But just as Chimamanda and Obinna discovered, freedom comes not from running, but from understanding and acceptance. Some wounds may never fully heal, but they don't have to define us. We have the power to take back control of our lives, to step out of the shadows, and to move forward, stronger, wiser, and unafraid. What about you? Have you ever had to face something from your past to truly move forward? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories like this. Where are you watching from? Let's connect.